I'm going to be talking about Psychology Paper 1. So it consists of 3 SAQs, one from each approach. We know that there is the biological, the cognitive, and the sociocultural approach in IB psychology. So there will be one SAQ for each of the 3 major approaches. And then there will be one ERQ that you'll have to answer. There's going to be 3 options for the ERQ. Again, one from the biological, one from the cognitive, and one from the sociocultural. And because you only have to answer one of the 3 questions, it's recommended that you pick one of the approaches to focus on, so you don't have to memorize all of the studies for every single approach, because that will be horrendous, and your brain will probably not be up to it when it comes to the exams. I personally did the biological approach because I found the extensions a little easier than the cognitive approach, but usually the biological and the cognitive are the most popular because of the small number of studies that you have to remember, and also the ease with which you can grasp the concepts compared to the sociocultural. But ultimately it's your choice, and you can choose to specialize in whichever one you feel comfortable in. For the SAQs, you don't get a choice, you just have to answer all 3 of them, so you have to be prepared for every single one of the topics. For the SAQ, there are 3 main components in writing a good one. So the first one, the introduction. This consists of the main topic, which will be very obvious in your question. And then you'll have to include relevant terminology and also highlight what you are going to talk about for the rest of your essay, basically a thesis statement. And for each topic, for example, one of the biological ones, neuroplasticity, well, then there's going to be certain things that the examiners expect you to know about that particular concept, and so you should be able to regurgitate that onto the paper. And I'll show you an example of an SAQ later in this video. The second part is the study. The way I did it was through this PRC. This basically stands for the aim of the study, what the study was trying to find out, what it was testing, the method, what type of study was it? Is it a lab study or a correlational study? And by method, I don't mean like the technology that they use, but like what kind of a study it was. The P stands for procedure, which is basically how the study was carried out by the researchers, like the first step, the second step, the third step, how they measured and operationalized everything. And then the R stands for the results. What did they find? Did they find that neurotransmission increased in certain environments with certain stimuli, or whatever the study was about? And then it would be the conclusion. What can we thus conclude from the findings? And the last part is the important part. It's the link. And this is essential to get you to a 7 level in your SAQ. And for the link, you're trying to use a few sentences to explain how you used this study that you described above to get a better understanding of this topic. Like, how did it support this topic? And an example will be this one. This is an SAQ I wrote about biases in thinking and decision making, which is a topic in the cognitive approach. If you get a question like, describe one study into one bias in thinking and or decision making. You'll dedicate your first paragraph to introducing what bias in thinking and decision making is. So this is just a short intro. Human beings are not always rational thinkers. Instead, we rely on intuitive thinking and take cognitive shortcuts called heuristics. These bolded words are some words that I thought were important in describing this topic. You can see that this paragraph is mainly dedicated to mentioning terminology and providing the definition or explaining what I mean by that specific term or phrase. And this is what I think is sufficient for explaining this topic. I got a 7 in psychology, so there should be enough. And of course, there are different things that you can include, but the essence of it is encapsulated here. So the study that I chose was English and Musweiler. Sorry if I'm butchering the name. This was a lab experiment. Here's the M part of the AMPRC, if you remember. And this was what it was. German law students were given a rape case and passages from the penal code, and they were told these scenarios and things like that. So this is the P, the procedure part of the AMPRC, and then this is the results, the R, and then C. It's dedicated here. Now, I said that the AMPRC is up here in the previous slide. And sometimes I include it here, sometimes I include it here. If it's a more complicated topic, I would include the conclusion here and then spend the rest of this paragraph breaking it down and explaining what I exactly mean by the conclusion or how I got to the conclusion. For example, if it involves a neural network and I want to elucidate the neural network, like the PFC amygdala circuit, then I'll include the conclusion here and then spend this paragraph explaining the network. But if it's something a little simpler, like this one, then I just merge the conclusion with the link paragraph. So here's my conclusion. It was concluded that anchoring bias may play a significant role in determining sentencing in courtrooms because the knowledge that the judge sentenced the perpetrator for either 34 or 12 months seemed to act as an anchor that affected the decisions of the German students. Therefore, this shows that humans exhibit anchoring bias in making decisions because the first piece of information that they get seems to act as an anchor in making subsequent decisions. So this is how you write an SAQ. The word count for this is 371, which is longer than what other websites say. It's recommended, I think I saw somewhere that an SAQ should be 250 words, which I think you could produce a level 7 essay with 250 words, but just to be safe, if you write it thoroughly like this, then you can ensure that you will get a 7 regardless of the subjectivity of examiners. You just have to write a little quicker than you would usually do, but throughout the 2 years you get practice, and eventually in the exams you'll be able to write quick enough to write even 450 words within the time limit of writing one SAQ, so you'll be fine. Let's move on to the ERQ. For the ERQ, you would have to write an introduction, and then the second will be highlighting the issue or the point of discussion, like what you're going to discuss in the essay. This will depend on the question. For example, if it's a to what extent question, then you would have to base your essay on to what extent blah blah blah. Or if it's a discuss question, you might say You might highlight an issue within the topic and then say, oh, so we're going to explore this issue. I'll break that down in some other videos, but I'll also show you an example of an ERQ later. The third paragraph will be the study, your first study, because in an ERQ you should include 2 studies. This will include the AMPRC, just like the SAQ, until like this part and this part is basically the same as the SAQ, so that should be fine. And then for this part, you would have to do the evaluation. This is the major difference between an SAQ and an ERQ. An SAQ just state the study, what the researchers did, and then state the findings and the link. But for an ERQ, you would have to state all of the findings and the aim and stuff like that for the study, and then you would have to evaluate the study, which is basically giving strengths and limitations of the study and how it could affect the findings or what we gain from it. After that paragraph, you would do the second study, and then you also do the AMPRCE, and then the evaluation. And then here you would do the holistic discussion. This is basically where you tie this study and this study together and find a common area of limitation to discuss about and how it affects the topic. Or you could talk about the applications of this topic, or you could talk about the fundamental issues of this theory that you're discussing about, or you could provide an alternative hypothesis. Like, there are a lot of ways that you could go about this, and I'll explore this in another video. You basically discuss and show your critical thinking to gain marks. Lastly, it will be the conclusion, which is basically just wrapping it up. The conclusion can be short and sweet. This is the format that I used for all of my ERQs. There are slightly different ways that you could go about this, but this is just the way that I found to be personally the most effective. An example of an ERQ I wrote is the hormone theory. So for the first paragraph, it's the introduction, which is basically unpacking the theory. Here I talked about the hormone that I'm going to talk about. Well, firstly, I talked about the hormone theory. Secondly, I talked about the hormone that I'm going to talk about. And then the third part of this is the behavior I'm going to talk about. And then at the end, I included a sentence to transition into the next paragraph. And then the next paragraph is where I highlighted the issue, which is that there are some questions on the theory of hormones, on how it influences human behavior. The issue, which was, since humans are complex and have mechanisms like thought processes that may mediate hormones and behavior, it's unclear whether testosterone actually increases the likelihood that an individual will act aggressively, or whether these mechanisms can overpower the effects of testosterone, and so hormones might not actually have that big of an effect on behavior as we thought. So we have to look into research that attempts to support the hormone theory. My first study and the second study. This paragraph is the first study, the AMPRC, and then here is the evaluation. You only need like around 2 strengths and 2 limitations. If you can't really find any, then like 2 strengths and 1 limitation, or 1 strength and 2 limitations are good enough, as long as you expand on them and explain it thoroughly. Don't just say the study lacks ecological validity and end it up there. That's not going to get you very far. You have to expand on like how the point that you're saying actually affected the findings and our understanding of the theory. So you have to unpack your point a little so that the examiners know that you actually understand the point that you're making and you didn't just like regurgitate a point that you remembered and could apply for basically any study. And then I moved on to the limitations. However, this correlation lends itself for bidirectional ambiguity. And so I unpack it. And then the second study, which helps to develop the study further. Usually you'll choose a study that is that has contradictory results to the first one, or you could choose one that addresses the strengths of the first one. So yeah, here is the AMPRC, and then here is the evaluation, and then the limitation was the uncertainty in whether the activation of the amygdala actually leads us to act more aggressively. And then after I explained it here, I used the sentence to transition into my holistic discussion, which was that there is an area of uncertainty, and explained the factor that I thought could play a role in between hormones and behavior, which was thinking and decision making. I used another study, Bachara et al., to provide support. For the holistic, if you decide to bring another study, you just say it really briefly, you just do AMPRC, and then you don't have to evaluate it because you won't have enough time for it, and it's completely fine. You don't even have to include a third study, if you don't want to, as long as you explain your point thoroughly and support it with something. Yeah, and so this is my conclusion. So when investigating the impacts of hormones on behavior, more should be considered. Blah, 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 blah. In conclusion, there is need for more research to clearly establish that hormones influence behaviors. You'll find that for a lot of essays, this conclusion works because psychology, or at least IB psychology, is really revolved around showing the examiners that you know that you can't really trust one single study because there is a limitation to what researchers can do with the current technology and the current ways in which we are allowed to investigate the human brain. So this is my go-to conclusion. You can think of other conclusions if you want, as long as you have a conclusion, because having this conclusion and following this essay format is going to help you gain points in organization. So yeah, that was the basic summary for what an IB Psychology Paper 1 is. Hopefully it was helpful, and I might make some videos on each of the topics for the SAQ and ERQs so that you know how to write a level 7 essay for IB Psychology.